Hi everybody, this is Steve Marinucci. Welcome to Beatles News Briefs number 115. And today we have a great discussion with the authors of these two books that I'm bringing in front of me here with difficulty. McCartney Legacy with Allan Kozinn and Adrian Sinclair. Um, you know both of them. They've been doing they've they've done a lot of things in the past. But for me, this is really kind of an interesting mini uh, things we said today reunion, and I'm looking forward to it. So hang on to your hats, and here we go. It's good to talk to both of you guys, and Alan, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Stu.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Good to see you, Steve. It's been a while.
We have many stories, Alan, that we could talk about, but we're not going to. I said this morning, I said I am not going to talk about Magical Mystery Tour.
Right.
So we're just going to talk about Paul McCartney. The obvious place to start is how did this thing get started? I mean, this is such an incredible project. And how'd you guys decide to go for this?
Well, it was really
Yeah.
Adrian's idea, so I'll let him take the genesis of it.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the genesis of the project, in the acknowledgements, I think it is in the first book. And I
right.
describe it as being like that scene from Withnail and I, where he says, we've got on holiday by accident, or is it by mistake that he says, Richard E. Grant. And really, this was a book project that happened by accident. Originally, I just wanted to write something in my spare time, some about a subject that I was passionate about, because day to day I work in television, and I just work on a lot of kind of entertainment documentaries, that kind of thing.
For
Do you,
people who aren't familiar with what you're doing,
Mm.
I assume most of it's in the UK.
I've worked for pretty much every major broadcaster in the world. Some of the stuff I've edited has been shown in the States, but yeah, primarily I work in television in Great Britain. I work on a lot of factual entertainment shows, mainly for Channel 4 over here.
Okay.
I wanted to do a project that I could really sink my teeth into. I'd started doing this sessionography of Paul McCartney, and really the project started to expand. And at that point, I decided that I wanted some cohorts to work alongside. It's a big project. McCartney's solo career is 50 plus years. So I enlisted Alan and Chip Madinger. And basically, the project just kind of snowballed from there on. Originally, what we were going to do is do something along the lines of Chip's Eight Arms. It was going to be almost like a refreshed version of that, which would be, written in part by Alan, in part by myself. But then we decided that really it was very difficult to separate Paul's life from his work. So we wanted to do more of a full-blown biography of Paul, and go into all of the details of his life rather than just what he was getting up to in the studio. Because really what happens in Paul's life informs what the music that he writes and the songs that he writes. And we found that kind of, mundane things would often trigger something, in Paul's creative engine to then go and write a song. So anyway, like I say, the whole project kind of snowballed, and eventually we took it to an agent in New York, our agent Matthew, and we had 3 offers for the book, and we ended up on Day Street Books, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. And here we are today, 2 books down the line, and a third currently in the works.
You said Chip was involved in the beginning. Obviously, I mean he's doing his own Lennon thing. Was he going to do the McCartney thing too, or was he just in it at the beginning with in an advisory capacity?
At the time he was involved, he was going to be acting fundamentally as the publisher, although we all 3
Ah,
would have had the byline because he has his own company, Open Your
right.
Books. And so he was going to be doing his Lennon thing, and I think with Scott Riley. and we were going to do the McCartney thing. And who knows, he could have ended up with a Beatles publishing empire and found someone to do the other two. But we ended up sort of parting ways with Chip, and philosophically, what we were doing became sort of different from what he was doing, so it wouldn't necessarily have fit in with his Lennon project, because we were turning it into a standard biography, but with a lot of focus on the studio sessions, because that's how we started. And it just sort of became something else, and it wasn't really a difficult split. I mean, we're still pals with Chip.
Oh yeah.
We just sort of went our separate ways on these projects, and so he sends us some things here and there that if he runs into something he thinks we'll be interested in, he sends it along, and so like that.
I was just going to say, Steve, I mean, fundamentally, because I've got a background in filmmaking and documentary making, I'm like a storyteller, is the way that I would describe myself. So the transferable skills I had from working on documentaries advises, the way I tell stories, and for me, Paul's story was kind of fundamentally the most important thing. And Allan's background, obviously, working at the New York Times, was predominantly as a critic. So the way he can dissect a piece of music is at a level far beyond, anything I can possibly do. And you'll see that in both of our books. There are sections that you'll look at and you'll see Allan's fingerprints very firmly pushed on certain pages, certain elements of the book that are maybe a little more philosophical, a little more story, really kind of trying to get behind Paul's eyes. Maybe the sections I had more of an imprint on. But Allan and I, over the time we've worked together, have kind of, we've merged our styles together, which was kind of one of the most difficult things to do, I think. I remember when we were doing early drafts and Allan would look at my stuff and it'd be almost like we were John and Paul, and he'd be thinking, oh, I quite like what Adie's done there. Maybe I'll nick a little bit of that into my next chapter. And we really kind of, our styles kind of rubbed off on one another. And eventually, we ended up with, the style that you'll see in both of those books.
Are the chapters written separately? In other words, Allan, or do you write a single chapter and then Adrian, you do one? Is that how it goes?
Yeah, a little. I've written, I would say most of them, and there are certain ones that Adrian has expressed an interest in doing, and he would do those, and then he would send it to me, and I always say I put it through the Kozinator so that it's stylistically consistent. But, it kind of works the other way too, because, I've gotten to see a lot of the way Adrian thinks in terms of storytelling. And, like, I'm not a film person. I was a print journalism person, and, journalism's sort of different. You just want to get the facts out there, concisely. Well, in my case, not so concisely, but I got to understand Adrian's way of looking at things kind of visually. And so by the time we finished the second book, I mean, the ending of the second book where, Paul goes to Japan and ends up in jail, I wrote that really trying almost to be Adrian, trying to think of it like, how would a filmmaker look at this, and how would I write it that way? So we've sort of picked up a lot of stylistic stuff from each other. So in a way, it's not so much like it has to go through the Kozinator anymore. It has to go through the both of us Ader. And that's what it is. I mean, there are certain things where I can look in the book and not know whether I wrote it or Adrian wrote it.
I mean, there's so much detail. It's kind of, I mean, I never even thought of that when I was reading through it, that, there was that kind of separation, because, having read Allan's stuff, through the years, I kind of recognize, and having, worked with you before, I mean, I know how detailed you are. And, and Adrian, you can read the book and you can see all the detail. And that's one of the really incredible things about the book is how much vivid detail is in there, and so it would, it's kind of difficult for me to pull that out. I mean, you guys, I think, have done a great job of integrating, all the detail and the what you guys bring to the table.
I
You
think a
know,
lot of the vividness and the color is either Adrian or Adrian's influence.
Okay.
yeah, I mean, thinking about the opening chapter of our first book, I remember having a conversation, and the way I thought about the first chapter of the book was, if you were doing a film about Paul's life after the Beatles, where would you start that film? And I said to Alan, it needs to be a really dramatic moment. And we ended up with Paul confronting the journalist outside his farmhouse in Scotland and throwing a bucket of scraps, kitchen scraps at them, and then punching the photographer. Interestingly, if you watch the new Morgan Neville documentary, Man on the Run, after they do a kind of recap of the Beatles in about a minute and a half, 2 minutes, that's really where that film begins, is Paul throwing kitchen scraps at a reporter. So, and I did work alongside, Morgan's team on the documentary, to some extent. And the first time I met with Morgan, he said to me that our book was like the blueprint for that film. And you can see it, that, the fingerprints of our book that are imprinted into that film, it's very hard to separate them. Obviously, we're both telling the same story, but, the storytelling instincts, very similar between ourselves and the filmmakers who made that film.
One thing that I wondered when I was looking through the book and having, just seen the film and the fact that McCartney has done so many legacy projects lately. I mean, there's the CD, there's the book, there's the film. I mean, was he answering what you guys did? Was that the motivation for him to do all this stuff at once?
Well, that's a really interesting question. It would be
Hmm.
flattering to say yes, that he was answering what we've done. I mean, it's very hard to it's very hard to not think that. Let's put it that way. I think that the film went into production around the time that Alan and I were writing Volume 1, so they were aware of it. And then obviously they've brought out this Wings book at the end of last year, which, was, I think, heavily influenced by our work. A lot of our research, some of our interviews and things have made it into that book, which is great to see. It's nice to see that McCartney's own people are embracing what we're doing. But yeah,
A footnote would have been nice, though.
yeah.
Oh, what? I'm sorry. What was that, Alan?
I said a footnote would have been nice, though. I mean, there's
They
no
didn't. They
no
didn't
admit.
There's
No,
no
there's no
footnotes.
acknowledgement whatsoever. There's not a bibliography either. So, but some of those are definitely our interviews because the interviewee sort of, died in between the time we did the interview and the time the book came out. So it's not like they got the person to say the same stuff again.
But in a way, it would be kind of quite nice to think that Man on the Run happened because of what Alan and I are doing, because it's such a fantastic film, and a film that, I think is just so long overdue. We had Wingspan, which, was, I mean, it told a story, and there was some fantastic archive footage in it, but it didn't really kind of give everybody in Wings a voice, shall we say. And I think Paul's far more honest and candid in the Man on the Run film than he's ever been. In fact, I think that looking at interviews he's doing at the moment, he's the most honest and candid he's been ever, really.
Why now, though? I mean, these aren't the first legacy projects he's done. In fact, I mean, you could compare what Yoko has put out and what he's put out, and they're almost on an even keel as far as the amount and although yeah, I mean, they both done a lot of legacy projects, but Paul just keeps doing them, and you have to wonder why. Is he does he feel that much of a need to keep up with Yoko and John's legacy, or is he ever searching for what the real answers are? Does that sound like a dumb?
Well, I doubt it's really competition with Yoko so much as he recognizes that he has a huge archive of materials that and when I say huge archive of materials, I mean, we're also talking about all of Linda's photos, and we're talking about, all of his recordings and the
Right,
paperwork. And I think he just wants to sort of exploit some of that archive because otherwise it's just sitting there and nobody sees anything. And I
right,
think he also wants to, justify. And when I say justify, I don't mean it in the, legal sense. I think he wants to, he's always been wanting his story as he sees it to be sort of understood and taken to heart by his fans and people out there. And, we're telling one version of it, which is the version of it that we consider the truth so far as we can find. He has his own version, some of which is a little mythological. And I think he
hmm
understands that, but he likes the myth. And so he wants to put out the myth. I mean, we're talking about only a few little points of disagreement. For us, I mean, Adrian managed to put together really an ironclad timeline for the Band on the Run sessions, particularly the ones in Lagos. And so we found out really that the day he was mugged, or the night he was mugged, was really the last day of recording. Now, he might have continued, but once he got mugged, and then the next day he had sort of a bronchial thing that he thought was a heart attack. And while he was recovering from that, I think he decided, okay, I've had enough. I'm going back to London. He might have stayed otherwise, if not for the mugging, and, which
right.
probably brought on the other thing. But the thing is that everything that they had recorded in Lagos already was recorded in Lagos. But the story, as Paul likes to tell it, was, well, they took my demo tapes and now he's added my lyric book. And it's a good thing I could remember the songs so that we could record them. But they had already recorded them, you know, just little things like that, And then there's the Live and Let Die story, which you know from volume one, where George Martin goes and plays the recording for the producers, and they want to know who's going to sing the part in the disco scene because Paul is contracted to write the title theme. George Martin doesn't quite understand that, and he says, if you don't have Paul singing the title theme, you're not going to get the song. Well, George Martin didn't understand that. So it was sort of a misunderstanding, but Paul understood it because Paul was privy to the contract, in which it said that there was going to be a second performance of the song in the disco scene by a female singer. And in that contract, Paul had agreed to produce that recording, which was originally going to be by the Fifth Dimension, was it? I think so. Yeah, Fifth Dimension. And then they dropped out and they tried other people. And it ended up that George Martin produced the recording that they used by BJ Arno. Paul liked that story, and I can see why he liked that story because it's a great story. It's just that we're not sort of in the business to tell the great story unless it's true. And in that case, it wasn't really. So we have these little tiny points of disagreement between the way Paul wants to tell it and the way we want to tell it. But ours is not authorized, and we have the freedom to tell it the way we find it.
And you did not interview Paul for this.
No. I mean, we can use the interviews I did with him when I was at the Times, when we get to the relevant sections, but he didn't want to be interviewed for this. He likes to keep his distance from biographies unless it's his own project.
Right, right.
But the one advantage we have over, say, the author of or the editor of his book, The Lyrics, and the editor of the Wings book, is that we're not just working with, say, 9 hours of new Paul interviews, or however many hours that they'll tell you are going into the latest project, 50 hours of Paul interviews. We're going from an archive of interviews that started, when our timeline begins and end now. So we've got literally thousands of interviews with Paul and people who've worked with Paul, members of Wings, the list is endless. So we can go from those interviews, and generally speaking, the closer you get to the event, the closer you get to the truth. Paul had an incredibly candid period in the 80s where he gave some very candid interviews after John's death, particularly a few years after John's death, when he felt like journalists were turning the timeline on him, and he felt that they were dressing John up as a martyr and he was being vilified. So he went through a very candid period in the 80s, and he'll go through those phases every so often. And like I say, that's the one advantage we have as biographers, is that we're not going from just a select number of hours of interviews that we've been told to use. We're going from everything that's available. So I'd like to think that what we present is slightly closer to the truth, maybe.
And you also had the freedom to go wherever you wanted to go, because he wasn't your boss, in other words, over the project.
Yeah.
I think you could probably say that he's still trying to establish, the real history. I mean, he's always, his interviews are always like that. Don't you think so? I mean, every time, he gets asked a question, it's, you hear a lot of the same answers too.
Yeah.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, Alan sent me an interview, was it yesterday, that Paul did with Vanity Fair. And I think it was related to the Jan Wenner project from a while back, Alan.
That book that came out about the history of Rolling Stone and Wenner, he went to interview Paul for it. And so only a bit had gotten in the book. This was an interview done in 2015. With the movie coming out and everything, he decided it would be a good idea to sell the interview as a QA to Vanity Fair. So that's what he did.
It's a really interesting interview, though. I mean, and he talks, well, he's asked directly.
I've seen.
He was asked directly about books like ours, but obviously because it was in 2015, that predates, I think, even when our project was announced. But he talks about Mark Lewison, and he says, I don't read those books because I'll read a few pages and I'll find a mistake and then I'll put it down. And that's kind of his stock answer to everything. So I can imagine that, if you were to work with Paul, and it'd be very hard to be confrontational about what's right and what's wrong, and we're very, very aware of this. This isn't our story. We're not telling our story, and that gets leveled at biographers all the time. You weren't there. This isn't your story. But we've spoken to hundreds of people who work with Paul. We've got an endless archive of interviews with Paul talking about, pretty much every aspect of his life and every event, major event and minor event, in fact, that's gone on in his life that we can mine. We are very mindful of the fact that this isn't our story. So, I don't want to sound coy, but it is a big responsibility, to try and convey the story of someone as famous as Paul and as influential as him. And that's why we put in as much work and effort and time and page count as we do, really, because, there aren't many people on the planet deserving of a multi-volume biography as Paul McCartney.
One thing I was going to mention, Alan, when you were talking about his archives, if you remember, I'm timing it because I remember writing about it at the time when he was in Vegas, when he opened the joint. He had done a big archive. He had started a big archive project. Do you remember that? It was a digital thing. It was. I think it was everything. He was really looking to get everything, to where and it includes music. It includes film. It's probably, but I mean, he's got his own big archive to work from, to to tell.
I seem to remember him doing some project where that was all supposed to be going online, and it never quite got there.
You're right. That was I think that was the announcement at the beginning, because yeah, I remember talking to somebody associated with it, and I think that's what they said. And it may be it's a private thing. It may be online, but not for us. I mean, maybe that's what they decided to do.
So why did he announce it publicly?
That's a good question.
It's like teasing us. But, we also have, one thing we have that he isn't going to have, because it's not really what he's doing. But, we've talked to all of these people who worked with him. And in volume 2, I mean, some of the best stuff was from the guys from Shoko, who did the lighting and the sound for his tour. And they have incredible memories, of things that went wrong at particular concerts and Paul's reaction. And when we listen to the bootlegs, some of that's borne out, they talk about what his reaction was, and we listen to the bootleg, and yeah, there's his reaction. And now we understand what it is that he's saying, which on the bootleg, it just sort of goes by you. But once you hear the explanation, it becomes clear. But those guys, they also brought a sort of a really human touch to it, because you have things like one of the, I think, lighting guys, in backstage playing darts with Paul. And then Ray Charles comes on the television singing one of Paul's songs. And the guy is just like, wow, I can't believe this, because he was just like some young Scottish guy, who never imagined he'd be in that situation. And there it was. So, those are great stories to get to, and they're part of the whole atmosphere of, one of our problems in a way is, when you've got tours to write about and you want to write in the sort of detail that we're doing, and you have someone like Paul who basically plays the same set every night and even has pretty much the same stage pattern between songs every night. What are you going to do? So people like that really kind of brought an extra dimension to it that I found really important. I found made it a lot more readable than it would have been if it was just, okay, and then they played Detroit and they did this and the journalist said that, It kind of helped, the number of seemingly extraneous, but not extraneous at all, people that we've interviewed.
You didn't talk to Paul. You did not talk to Denny Laine, which I thought was kind of interesting that Denny wouldn't talk to you.
Yeah, well, you know what? I think Denny's wife, who was basically his gatekeeper, confused us with another writer named Adrian Allan, who also even spells Allan the same way, because he had apparently been trying to get an interview with Denny, and I'm not sure what went on between him and Denny's wife, but somehow she ended up offended by him. And when Adrian wrote to her, she wrote back and said, I told you not to contact me again. And Adrian hadn't written before. This was the first time. So it seemed pretty clear that she was confusing us with him. So it's a pity, but, we have a lot of interviews with Denny as well. There's 4 hours of Denny on video talking to a film company called Prism Films. So there's plenty of Denny out there that we could draw on. Would have been great to talk to him, but somehow we couldn't get past that misunderstanding about who we were.
Yeah, it was frustrating with Denny, but you get the feeling with Denny that he wasn't really comfortable talking to biographers anyway, really. Ever since, was it 84 that he did that kind of multi-piece kind of sellout to one of the British tabloids, and him and Paul fell out after that. And Denny had been working on a memoir around that time, and which never happened. I think that after the disagreement with Paul and everything that came out in the press, that was kind of put on ice. So I'm sure that memoir probably still exists somewhere. But yeah, he was the only, at the time, living member of Wings that we haven't spoken to, because we've spoken to Denny Sywell. I was the first person to really speak to Jeff Britton, I actually flew out to Spain to meet with Jeff Britton to convince him to speak to us, and now we're good friends. And I even managed to speak to Joe English on 2 occasions, which I don't think anyone's been able to do really, other than on official projects. But yeah, Denny was the one that got away, as they say. But like Alan said, we've got a rich archive of interviews with Denny talking about pretty much everything that went on. I get the feeling that even if we had spoken to Denny, he wouldn't have been honest about what actually happened. I think the closest we'll ever get to the truth of how he felt about some of the bad stuff that went down actually came out in that 1984 expose that he did of Paul.
Mm-hmm. Who did you talk to? Reel off who you talked to.
We've spoken to pretty much every musician, recording engineer, producer who worked with Paul during the 1970s. Everyone from session players through to members of the horn section who toured with Paul and recorded with Paul. I think we've spoken to every recording engineer with the exception of Jeff Emerick. We had to rely on Jeff Emerick archive interviews. Yeah, and like Alan said, we even spoke to members of the Shoko, the touring entourage that did the 75, 76 tour, 79 tour. We spoke to lots of people who worked on the 72 and 73 tours. I mean, like I said, the list is pretty endless.
Stephen Thomas.
And Stephen Thomas, yeah, that was another interesting one. He's the guy who basically was one of the designers who designed Paul's offices in London at one Soho Square. And Steve Thomas is, particularly candid. He's the guy that basically told Paul to his face that he thought that Well of Kintyre was crap. Ooh. Even Paul, after Paul played it to him 16 times or something on a cassette.
He built a studio that Paul wanted, the studio up in Scotland specifically to record Mull of Kintyre, and gave Stephen Thomas, a month to build it. And they did it. And then he told Paul that I was more of a Rolling Stones guy. And if I was listening to the Beatles, I was more of a John guy. And so Paul invited him up to play him basically the product of that studio he built, Mull of Kintyre. But he knew what his tastes were. So the first thing he did is he played it for Stephen Thomas, and Stephen Thomas just wasn't enthusiastic about it, so he kept playing it. He played it for him like 14 times until Thomas finally said, look, yeah, okay, I like it. And Paul said, I know you don't, but this is for you. And he handed him a cassette that was the B-side, Girl School, which was much more of the kind of thing Stephen Thomas liked, rockin'. And that was that was another great story in the book that, again, if we hadn't looked up Stephen Thomas, I say I mean Adrian, hadn't looked up Stephen Thomas, we wouldn't have that. It's part of the story, it's not maybe the most important thing in the universe, but it's great. It shows you how Paul can deal even with someone who says outright that he doesn't like certain things that Paul's done musically.
One of the things I looked for in the book, after I got the first volume, was what you said about Francie Schwartz. I think that I have a history with her. I interviewed her back for the Abbey Road site, but I don't know if I ever told you, Alan, that she used to call me a lot.
Really?
Yes, she used to phone me, and she used to tell me some weird stuff. The one thing I do remember that she told me was that she was angry that Paul made disparaging remarks about Yoko. She told me that on several occasions, and she went through the details, and I don't remember the details exactly. But let's just say, yeah, they weren't very nice. And I haven't heard from her in many, many years. But I used to get a lot of phone calls from her, and she used to talk a long time.
Yeah, we had to deal with the release of her book in Volume 1, and Paul and Linda's response to that. And I think Linda made some kind of cutting remark about her when she was speaking to someone like Paul Gambaccini. Said that she said something about she was a lucky girl that she got one lay or something. She was just some really disparaging remark about her. But yeah, we were mindful of kind of not going into too much detail about what was in Body Count,
Right.
which it's not even in print anymore, is it? You can't get hold of
No,
it.
no, you
It's
can, I mean, you can
yeah.
find it and it costs a lot of money, but yeah, it hasn't been in print for a long time.
There are obviously a lot of really, a lot of bedtime stories in there. Not bedtime stories, sorry, bedroom stories, aren't there, about her and Paul, and some really revealing things about the way that Paul responded to certain situations socially. And yeah, it's a really fascinating read, actually. Do you get the feeling that it was all true though, Steve, or was there some is there some fan fiction in there, do you think?
Well, she had, I think, she wasn't always truthful. And the
Mm.
reason why I say that is because I asked her point blank, I said, "Did Jane Asher find you in bed with Paul?" She said no. And I think you guys said it in the book that it was true. And
Mm.
she told me it wasn't.
Mm.
So, I mean, you know, I put that as, it was hard probably to say that everything she told me was truthful. That thing about Paul, about what he said about Yoko, was that true? I don't know. I will say, and it was really obvious, she was bitter that Paul dropped her. She was very bitter about that.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the topics, or one of the subjects that's most difficult for Alan and I to cover, is what was going on in Paul's sex life, really. Mainly because our timeline kind of starts after, supposedly after Paul's bachelor days. And, for all of our narrative, he's married to Linda. But we did have to touch on a couple of relationships.
Right.
I found it fascinating that we only discovered this when we were writing the first book, that Paul had a little tryst with Maggie McGiven, hadn't he? And it
Right.
then turned out that when Wings got together, that Maggie was dating Denny Laine at the time. And they bumped into each
Hmm.
other socially. And yeah, you can just imagine how awkward that must have been. Denny with one of Paul's exes, and Paul's there with Linda. There's no wonder why partners and girlfriends were subsequently banned from attending recording sessions.
You were talking about Mull of Kintyre. It brought up a question that I've had for a long time, and I've never seen really answered to my satisfaction, is why he doesn't play Mull of Kintyre in America. Do you know, Ellen?
Um,
Is it because it didn't hit number one here? That's what I keep
well,
thinking.
well, even when it came out, EMI felt that Girl School would be more likely to be a hit here.
Hmm.
Maybe he just feels that, okay, the prevailing wisdom is that that Americans wouldn't like this song. So I don't know. That's my best guess. It's not based on any direct knowledge of why, but I mean, he only doesn't play it in that many places. I mean, he plays it in Canada, he plays it in Britain. Does he do it in Australia? I think he might have done it once.
I have to say, I really love that song, and I would love to hear him do it.
Hmm. Well,
Let's talk about Linda. How big of a gamble do you think he was taking in accepting Linda as a member of the band?
Well, I think the person who summed it up best for us was Denny Sywell. Was when he described Linda as being Paul's comfort blanket. He said that really she was just there as a calming presence for Paul. In fact, I think Denny Sywell even said to us, she was never really in the beginning considered as a proper member of the band. He was just
Hmm.
there to do backing vocals, and really she kind of grew into her role as a keyboardist. The further they went along. And I think really playing live is kind of what made Linda, forced to do that, starting from the university tour onwards. She probably found that incredibly difficult, and then started taking lessons for subsequent tours and got, you know, more and more competent on the keys, and she was, by those final tours, she was running 5 or 6 keyboards, wasn't she? She was doing a lot of stuff. But yeah, originally, as Paul says in the film, she was just there to give him the confidence to get back out again, really.
But even as early as Band on the Run, so that some of those synthesizer parts were her parts, and we have in that volume 1, where we discuss that, where he's meeting with Tony Visconti to do orchestral arrangements, and Visconti talks about how I've got this idea for the beginning of this song, and Linda chimes in from across the room saying, "You're not burying my synthesizer line." So she obviously had some pride of ownership of some of these things that she had come up with. And as Adrian said, by the end of the Wings Over America tour, and then they went back to Europe and played a few more concerts, she was playing, and the critics were noting that as well. And then in '79, when they went out again, she was now a decent enough keyboard player. I mean, Wings is an Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I mean, keyboards are part of the texture, but they're not the lead thing, unless Paul's playing. But
right.
I think the most interesting thing that came out of the Man on the Run documentary were those kind of little candid glimpses of Paul and Linda in the studio together. I would love to have heard a little bit more of that scattered throughout the film, actually, because it was just very revealing how comfortable they were in a vocal booth together, and goofing around, and and they developed that vocal sound throughout those sessions. And Paul clearly saw something in Linda that maybe she didn't see in herself during those recording sessions, and gave her the confidence to stand in front of a microphone and sing. And that vocal blend between the two of them, and then eventually with the two of them and Denny, was so integral to the sound of Wings. And
she really
at the end of the
developed.
film, when they do that a cappella "You Are My Sunshine," just Paul, Denny, and Linda, and no instrumental backing or anything, I mean, that's just beautiful, and it shows you how that blend worked. And that's a recording I'd never heard before, so that was a really nice surprise.
She really developed. She started out rough, but she got much, much better as time went on. It was definitely a good decision. She took a lot of heat, but she lived through it, and she did very well.
She also was very honest about it. I mean, she did a lot of interviews, and she said, "Yeah, everyone says I'm not a good keyboard player, and they're probably right. Everyone says I don't belong in the band, and they're probably right. I'm here because Paul wants me here. I didn't beg to be here." And even when people asked her, well, what's it like having Paul as a teacher? Is he like, does he teach you keyboard things and all that? She's, oh no, he has absolutely no patience for anyone who can't do what he can already do, So she was right out there, she said what she had to say, and she was honest about it. She wasn't pretending to be anything that she wasn't. And, it made her, to me, I mean, while writing it and everything, she seemed very sympathetic as a character most of the time.
I think she's one of the most interesting, players in the story, in fact. And when I read reviews of our first volume, I think one of my favorite reviews, highlighted the fact that we present a very rounded and balanced account of Linda. And we're not just out to stitch her up, because, it would be very easy to be disparaging about Linda's contribution. But I was having this conversation with Allan recently. I think that her role within Wings is very, very misunderstood and understated, really, because she was there all the time when Paul was writing songs. And we saw for ourselves, even some of the lyrics for Live and Let Die were written by Linda. Well, they were certainly in her notebook, in her writing. She'd written some lines that were then adapted for Live and Let Die. So she clearly had an input in everything that Paul was doing. And if you listen to the recent Wings compilation that they brought out, if you listen to that from track 1 to the end, you can just hear, without Linda, there is no Wings, because her vocal contributions and synth lines are so integral to everything that band did. I think a Billy Preston, for example, wouldn't have played the line that Linda plays on Band on the Run. He just wouldn't. He wouldn't have played that kind of. That's the sort of line that someone who only has a basic understanding of keyboards would play. It's sort of, it's very, very simple, but it's so important within the texture of that song. And I think that applies to so much of what she did as the keyboard player, vocalist in Wings. And like Alan said, when you see her, Denny and Paul doing You Are My Sunshine in the Man on the Run film, I mean, that's one of the highlight moments of the film. It's absolutely beautiful just hearing those three voices a cappella.
This is probably a weird question to ask, but given the Wings book, Man on the Run, and to a lesser extent, the CD set, where do your books fit in as far as that goes? I guess the answer is that your books are more of the whole story than Man on the Run.
Yes, we unlike Man on the Run, actually mention and go into great detail on all 7 of Wings' studio albums. 4 of those albums are not even mentioned in Man on the Run, which I found astonishing, but maybe when he puts out the director's cut, it will be in there, because that's apparently twice as long.
Is he putting out a director's cut?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was a whole section, Morgan said in his Q&A in London that I was at, there was a whole section about Nashville in his original cut, a 3-hour cut, I think he said it was, or over 3 hours. And that was all taken out of the final cut, whereas in our book, in volume 2, I'd say that the chapter on Nashville is one of the chapters I'm most proud of in both of those books, really, because again, we took a timeline handed to us by Jeff Britton, who very conveniently kept a diary in 1974 and was happy to share the details of his diary with us. So we took that as the timeline. We gave a definitive account of everything that happened in Nashville, what day Paul wrote Sally G, where they were the night before, which clubs they went to, Paul's mood in Nashville, because apparently he got very depressed, the way the band wasn't gelling. And yeah, if you read that chapter about Nashville, it's so full of life and full of incident as well. But as I said to Alan on another podcast, the thing about the Man on the Run film is it's the story of Paul McCartney. It's not the story of Wings. So I think as a film viewer, you've got to read the title and accept that it is Paul McCartney, Man on the Run, not Wings, Man on the Run.
Because
So
that was one of the things that really disappointed me about the movie, that especially compared next to the Wings book. There was so much more in the Wings book, although the Wings book is an oral history and approaches things. They're both coming from different viewpoints, and there's a difference there. But for what it was, Man on the Run was good, but I think it could have been. I mean, leaving out what you were just talking about, I think there could have been so much more. What can I say? One thing that I you noted in the introduction to Volume 2 is that you tried to tell the story as it unfolded without the knowledge of where the events you were describing will lead. And that sounds kind of like a journalistic point of view, which is not surprising with you, Alan. It also somewhat reflects what Mark Lewison is doing with his books. Do you agree with that? Is that the way you went through the story to tell the story?
Basically, although it's funny that you see it as a journalistic thing, and that it's not surprising that I did it that way, because I actually fought against that.
Did you really?
My feeling about it was that with the Beatles, it was one thing, and Chip is doing that with Lennon too. So with Lennon, it was another thing. But Paul is a guy who will record 50 tracks or however many it was during the Ram sessions. I think it was over 30. And some of those tracks wouldn't turn up publicly for another 5 years, 6 years, 20 years, 30 years. I mean, he'll return to older stuff and continue working on it and put it out. And I found it a little frustrating to not be able to say what was going to happen with a track that we're describing. So, my way of sort of cheating a little sometimes was to do something in a footnote, or, we could break out of the strict chronology by going into a footnote and saying something, because also then you run into, although we set out specifically in the introduction that this is what we're doing, we're trying to not have wisdom of foreknowledge or whatever, but nevertheless you also run the risk of the person reading it saying, wow, these guys don't even know that that's the track that was renamed into this and released that way. So we just want to like cover all the bases. But
yeah, I was just going to say, Alan, when we were writing it, I think you described it as the pressure release valve, that you would use footnotes to kind of put those little journalistic details in there that you were desperate to get into the body of the narrative, but I was fighting so heavily to keep out. For me, what's so intriguing about the story is seeing it play out, like a novel, really. And if you give away the ending, before you get there, then where's the surprise? And you've got to remember that there will be people reading our books that aren't as well schooled in Paul history as we are. There'll be kids reading these books that are 16, 17, 18, who are reading about Paul's life for the very first time. And for them, that's the adventure of reading the book, is that it then becomes a page turner of what happens next. And giving away, like you say, the fact that he'd release it on a B-side in the Flowers and the Dirt era, it's just not a relevant detail to what's happening at that time. But I think that's really the only real point that became a problem, isn't it? During recording sessions where you'd have those leftovers. It's kind of, what did he do with those leftovers? Well, you have to buy the next volume to find out.
Otherwise, it was sort of an interesting discipline. The other thing about being able to jump out of the chronology and say the consequences of something is that in a way it saves you a little bit of space. And, our books are really long, and which is fine.
Is the third one going to be even longer?
Well, the third one covers 10 years, and the first one was 4 years. The second one was 6 years. And now we're up to 10 years. So I don't think it can be longer, but it can be the same length. And it will definitely be the same length, I'm pretty sure, because there's so much to cover in that decade,
Since I brought it up, when is the third one coming?
It looks like 2028.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. When is it due?
Next December.
Right.
Yeah, so we deliver next December, and then it will probably be a year in edit and production. Yeah, so 2028 I think is probably a realistic target.
So that one's going to cover what to what?
1980 to 1989.
Okay, how many volumes are you talking altogether?
5, ideally. Actually.
Okay.
I don't know about ideally, 6 maybe ideally, but there's
really?
no way. Because, he keeps going, he doesn't stop. He doesn't retire. He's working on what now will be I think a double album, right? He says he's got 25
Is it a
songs.
double? It's a double. I only heard it.
Well, he says he's got 25 songs.
No.
Unless they're all like Her Majesty.
You could put it in a deluxe box set, though.
Right.
But the thing about the third volume is that the story shifts fundamentally after John's death and after Wings folds, So, Paul doesn't tour then until 1989, other than the odd gig. He does Live Aid and a couple of other live appearances, but there's really not a lot going on the road. Mainly because he was, I think, just so terrified for his life. Really, he felt very exposed when John was killed, right. and George even more so. I was reading some interviews with George recently about his reaction to John's death, which I'd never really heard before. So that's another interesting thing for us to explore. Really, is kind of how all three of them responded. There are so many other things going on in the 80s, but fundamentally it becomes kind of the story of, Paul recording studio albums, doing Broad Street, and then, in amongst that, a lot more legal wrangles, really. I mean, they go to war with EMI, ATV again, and then obviously there's the whole Michael Jackson saga with Northern Songs, which we've got some incredible material about. I think that will be one of the headline stories probably from the next book is the Northern Song sale.
You want to drop a little hint about?
It's just a really interesting story. It's when you're interviewing someone and they say something to you like, you've been told this story. Well, that's really not what happened. This is what happened. And there are a few of those coming up and we're constantly working on. Every time we interview someone, we tend to find out something, but there are some particularly big ones coming up in the third book. Like I say, fundamentally, it's a very different story. I think once you extract the touring from the equation, fitting everything into 750 pages or whatever our editor will allow us for volume 3, I think should be okay.
If you were to describe Paul's career in general terms, and we're talking about, to the present, everything he's done, the classical, the avant-garde, and wings of the whole rock music, the Beatles. How would you describe his attitude towards his career, the way he's gone so many different places, testing the waters, I guess you could say? How would you categorize him in a few sentences?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard because of the scope that you just outlined.
Right.
I mean, to use a cliche, the phrase Renaissance man, I mean, the guy paints, does the classical things, or did the classical things, but he has some that he's never put out publicly. Like he has a guitar concerto that he worked on. And so I don't know to what extent he still tinkers with those. He's got a Broadway show that we've never seen, It's a Wonderful Life. That apparently fell apart in a dispute with the producer, director, whatever. So that, I don't know if we'll ever see that, but we may hear the music from it.
Didn't the producer pass away? Was it Bill Kenwright?
Was it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was Bill Kenwright.
I would say the thing about him is that if we're talking about the overall scope of his career, the big quality would be curiosity. I mean, he's curious about all of these art forms. He wants to try his hand at all of these art forms. And even if we're talking about just music and excluding the classical part, I mean, just look at his pop catalog. He's got electronic things, like McCartney 2, all that experimentation, and then The Fireman later on. And then otherwise it ranges from, just straightforward pop, even saccharine pop, I mean, Mary Had a Little Lamb and stuff like that, all the way to, much harder stuff, so, Spin It On and I've Had Enough and rockier things that he's done. And this is not even mentioning his Beatles catalog. I mean, even within the Beatles catalog, there's a huge expanse of style that he's covered. So I would say, curiosity about various art forms, how they're done, and what it would be like if he were doing them, and then he does them.
Yeah.
But Adrian may have a different...
Well, I think, yeah, you're right. I think there's probably rarely he will visit a location without trying to absorb and replicate the music scene there. It happened in Nashville, New Orleans. I'm sure if reggae, obviously he got from his trips to the Caribbean. I'm sure if you were to look across Paul's entire career, you'd find examples of that everywhere. But yeah, curiosity, he's a guy with boundless energy. I mean, even to this day, the fact that he can still tour and play a 3-hour set in his 80s is staggering, I think if I'm still living and breathing in my 80s, I'll be happy, let alone playing a 3-hour set. I mean, I think he's a remarkable human being. I think we could all maybe learn a lesson from some of the lifestyle choices he's made later in his life to prolong his life. But yeah, he's just restless. He's a restless artist. Maybe he's got an element of ADHD or some other neurodivergence that makes him that way. I could certainly sympathize.
I don't want to wind up the discussion with this question, but there's been discussion on the internet that maybe he should retire, given, his voice. What do you say? I mean, obviously he loves what he's doing. There's no question. And I will say, the last time I saw him, there's this feeling that you get when he comes out on stage that you won't see anywhere. You won't see anywhere else. That even if you're not a big fan, you feel something inside of you because it's such a great thing to see him out there.
Yeah, I would disagree with that, and when you go to the Beatle conventions, I think the overwhelming feeling you get from people is that, Paul brings so much joy to the world. So why would you take that away from someone who's seeing him for the first time or seeing them for the 1000th time? What I'd like to see personally is Paul embrace his shifting vocals on record, maybe in the way that Johnny Cash did on his last album.
Right.
That kind of explore the vulnerability of his voice rather than trying to dress it up. I think we saw a little bit of that on McCartney 3, that vulnerability, but I'd love to see more of that on his new record. What I really don't want to see on his next record is him just trying to put out another pop record with songs like If You Come On To Me, I'll Come On To You. I just don't feel like those kinds of songs are, they're good fun, right? They're good fun, but they're not befitting a man of his age and status. I'd like to see him explore the delicate side of his songwriting and vocals, really.
I always thought that he should do, adopt, the sort of old bluesman approach and do that, blues growl,
Ooh, that's
just 17. You know what I mean. He could do that. But about the broader question, it sort of reminded me of the first time I went to Beatlefest to promote my Phaidon book about the Beatles, and the guy running the panel I was on asked me, "So Allan Kozinn, why should people buy your book?" And I said, well, people should buy my book if they want to buy my book, and they shouldn't buy my book if they don't want to buy my book. And I looked out in the audience, and, there was Joey Self out there going, oh, my God. I think that Paul should retire if he wants to retire, and he shouldn't retire if he doesn't want to retire. It's just like that.
I mentioned that we both know Joey for many years. Joey, hello, if you're out there. But you said he should retire if he wants to retire.
If he wants to, and if he doesn't want to, he shouldn't. He should just do what he wants to do. But, he shouldn't be charging like, $300 a ticket. And if you think about it, you could have seen the Beatles for $5,
Mm-hmm.
But, look, he does a show that's pretty expensive to tour around the world. You look at what he puts on the stage and on the screen and in the lighting, that doesn't come cheap. And I think if he's not going to retire and he's going to continue touring, doesn't have to do it as a charity. I think he should just do what he wants to do. I mean, he does this. His voice is what it is. The ticket prices are what they are. All his concerts are sold out. That's sort of the answer to the question.
No, that's a good answer. Gentlemen, this has been a blast for me. It's been great talking to both of you. This has been a lot of fun talking about your books. And I'm a little disappointed that we're going to have to wait so long for volume 3, but what can I say? It'll be worth it.
I mean, it's a lot of work. I don't think we can do it any faster than we're doing it. And, we want to maintain the consistent quality level, and,
right.
Adrian was talking about reviews before and what our favorite reviews were. Mine is still the one from the Mail on Sunday where the guy said, if the devil is in the details, the McCartney Legacy is positively satanic. I love it.
Oh my God, that's beautiful. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you very much. And as I usually do here, I'm going to fumble around. I'm finally knowing where the stop button is, so I'm going to stop it like right now. So what you saw and heard there was the original ending of the show. But once we stopped recording, we started talking. And one of the things we talked about was the Hamburg tapes, which, if you've been listening to this show, you know is one of my favorite subjects of the Beatles doing something, or specifically actually Peter Jackson doing something with the Hamburg tapes with his Mal software. And Alan and I and Adrian started talking, and we came up with enough interesting material that I thought I'd give you a little taste of what happened after the show was supposed to end. So here it is. We're going back in here because we were talking after the taping ended, and Alan and I got into talking about the Hamburg tapes and Peter Jackson. And as I've said before, I really want to see the improved version of the Hamburg tapes.
The master is lost, but there is a safety copy, and the lowest surviving generation safety copy is now owned by Peter Jackson, who I know would really like to bring it out too, would like to put it through his mal process and demix it and see what can be done with it. But that's a matter of whether Apple will agree to releasing it. And, the Beatles themselves, don't seem that keen on having it out, or the surviving Beatles. And
well, they sued over that.
They did. And George actually made a court appearance
right
to stop it. So
exactly.
Yeah, so I don't have great hopes that we'll be seeing that. But, in the meantime, are you familiar with the guy who goes under the name Lord Reith?
Yes. Yes, I am.
He's put it out many times, and improving the quality each time. And the current one is called 17, I believe. So that's the one to look for.
But yeah, he has done some incredible work. There's been some incredible work done with that tape. And what they did in the anthology, it knocked me over. I was just astonished. And if they could put the whole tape out like that, good grief.
Yeah, not to mention that they used Red Hot, which wasn't even on the original album.
Right.
It's
right.
also not complete, as far as I know.
I think you're right about that. But to go back and briefly go back to the Decca tape discussion, where Paul has that Canadian tape now, who knows? Hopefully, put it all out. That's what Mark Lewison says, and I'm sure you believe that too.
Yeah. A couple of episodes ago on Things We Said Today, we had a discussion of basically Giles Martin has said, there's really no more interesting stuff in the vault to put out. Mm-hmm. And all of us have lots of ideas about how much interesting stuff there is in the vault to put out. And from my point of view, it should be absolutely everything that's in the vault. Meaning all of the session masters, the unmixed tapes, basically all of what are now called stems, just put them out, or make a website that has the complete contents of the EMI archive, and you can log in and, do your own mixes, do whatever you want. So that's my theory, and we devoted the whole show to that. So.
That's a dangerous idea. Can you imagine? I can't imagine them agreeing to that, but yeah,
they never listen to me.
No, but that would be a fun. That would be great.
Paul did that on his website, didn't he? For a while, do you remember? He released a handful of tracks, and you could do your own mixes.
Who did?
Yeah, Paul on his official site. Yeah, he only did a handful of songs. And they were, I think, mixed down to 4-track, but you could basically go in and make your own mixes of things like Monkberry Moon Delight. And that was a lot of fun.
I don't remember that, but okay.
But yeah, if the Beatles did that, little 8-track where you could play around and remix, I don't know, the White Album or Sgt. Pepper or something.
That would be something. All right. before we go too crazy, thank you again. Allan, say hi to everybody over at Things We Said Today, and this is it, finally. Here are two late-breaking Beatle news briefs. Paul McCartney announced on March 17th a two-night gig at the Fonda Theater in Los Angeles at 8:30 p.m. Friday, March 27th, and 8 p.m. Saturday, March 28th. Registration for the show began March 17th at www.axe, that's axe.com/Paul McCartney. Tickets are sold to selected registered fans, and there's a limit of 2 tickets per person selected. The show details say that this will be a phone-free show, and all phones will be secured in yonder pouches, which fans will have in their possession at all times during the show. They've used this before, and it's interesting that they had said the same thing about the show in New York, and people still got their phones in. Well, take it for what it is. The show is an MPL presentation in association with Golden Voice and Martial Arts USA. And also the long-awaited film John and Yoko Plastic Ono Band with Elephant's Memory and special guests at the One-to-One concert in New York City in 1972 will be exhibited in theaters starting April 29th for a limited engagement. Tickets go on sale March 20th. For more information, see powertothepeoplefilm.com. And if you're asking whether the song left off the box set will be in the film, the word we had from Elephant's Memory member Gary Von Skyok is that it will not be. And get all the latest news and much more each day at our Beatles News and Information page on Facebook. You're welcome to come join us. That's all for now. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. You can hear our complete list of shows at marinucci.podbean.com in audio and in video and audio at youtube.com. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. We would love to have you, and you'd find out about the shows as soon as they're published. Again, thanks for supporting us, and take care, everybody, and until next time, we'll be seeing you.